Hello, everybody. Welcome to this reproducibility. It is my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Devezer. She's a professor of marketing and affiliated faculty at the Department of Mathematics and Statistical Science at the University of Idaho. She holds a PhD in marketing and then master in statistics from Washington State University. She's interested in advancing models and theories of science, also called meta science. Her research brings together statistical theory, experimental methodologies, mathematical modeling, philosophy, and the history of science to advance an interdisciplinary understanding of the scientific process. Some of her specific topics include the interface between tension and the interface and tension between scientific and statistical inference, the objectives and values of science, the role of replications and reproducibility of scientific findings in advancing knowledge, the epistemic value of scientific experiments, and the role of modeling and exploration in scientific progress. Today, she will talk about on scientific rigor, a case study, and this will be about a high-profile replication article titled High Replicability of Newly Discovered Social Behavior Findings is Achievable, which was published in the journal Nature Human Behavior in November 23. And after some harsh critique, it was retracted in September 24. And Berna will now tell you more of how this happened and what was going on there. So, Berna, I'm very curious to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Bernhard. Thanks for inviting me too. Let me just share my slides first. So, yes, I will talk about this case study of the retraction and a little bit of background information on our side of things, how this happened, how I got involved. There's a lot more detail in this whole process than I could share like in half an hour, so I had to take out a lot of stuff. If anyone's interested in the longer version of this, I can send you the slides, the longer version with all the links as well. So let's see, I broke this whole process down into a few phases, and it all starts with the prologue is basically how I got involved in this. So it all started with an email that I received from a reporter at Science magazine, and this was before, it was November 6th, 2023. This was before the target paper was published. So during the embargo period, she wanted to publish an article together with the publication of the paper and wanted to get some comments on it. So she sent me the paper, said that, it's the embargo, so I shouldn't be talking about it publicly, but would I be interested in commenting on it? And I said, okay, let me read first and then I'll think about it. So that's how I got, I knew about the existence of this paper before it was published. And this was the paper that she sent with me, basically the published version. It's 17 authors on this paper, and let me just read part of what's in the abstract. It says that this paper reports an investigation by 4 coordinated laboratories for the prospective replicability of 16 novel experimental findings using rigor-enhancing practices, such as confirmatory tests, large sample sizes, pre-registration, and methodological transparency. And I say, in contrast to past systematic replication efforts that reported replication rates averaging 50%, replication attempts here produced the expected effects with significance testing in 86% of the attempts, slightly exceeding the maximum expected replicability based on observed effect sizes and sample sizes. So this is the way the results in this paper were framed in the paper. And let's see, this was the design. So they have 4 labs. Each lab has suggested 4 effects for these replication studies, which makes 16 effects that you see in total. So the yellow ones are the original studies reporting the effects. And then light blue ones are the self-replication studies conducted within the same lab. And then the green ones are other external replications or independent replications conducted in each of the other labs. And this is basically the whole design of the study. What's being manipulated here is it's within each lab, the number of studies and the rotation of replications across labs. And there were a couple of other manipulations of splitting the samples in half and like giving it different halves of the sample the same manipulation in a different order. So let's see. My first impressions, I took 2 days to read this paper very carefully, including the appendices, the supplementary um, materials that they submitted with it. And at first, I thought theoretically, nothing they report is surprising. So it's very interesting to me that this made it to the title of the study, as if we shouldn't expect high replicability at all. Like, of course, it's possible because, from my perspective, it's because of how replicability actually works. Like, you can produce replicability from 0% to 100%. It's not a big deal, especially if you're controlling things as closely as you are, as in this study. It's not surprising. And actually, we have seen examples of such high reproducibilities in the literature before, except the authors are not citing them as historical points of comparison. They're kind of leaving them out of that 50% average calculation. The second thing that I noticed is despite results being theoretically kind of unsurprising or uninteresting to me, methodologically, the numbers that they report, they seem inflated for multiple reasons. First one is that the reproducibility rate calculation, the way they use it, or replicability, is ad hoc. It's not something that you see in the prior literature because of the way they do it. So first one, let me just rewind here first. Interestingly, what you would expect normally is that the yellow one, the original study, would determine the effect that is being used as a reference point, and then replications would be interpreted according to that. So if they find the same result, it would be a successful replication. If they don't, it would be a failed replication, etc. That's not how this study does it. They ignore the confirmatory test completely. They're not factored in. So if a confirmatory study, for instance, found a null result, reported a null result, and then some of the replications found a positive result instead, that was registered as a successful replication, which is not something that you find in the literature. It's very idiosyncratic. Also, it sums across the replications across effects within labs and across labs together. So it's so many levels of replicability kind of mixed up together. So the replicability rate they report is also not robust. And you can see that because they report lower rates in the supplements using different metrics, but they did not carry those in the paper. And then there's a massive selection bias in this paper because of the process in which these effects have been selected. The labs were left to their own means to decide which effects to recommend for replication, and they basically found the strongest effects that they thought would replicate. And it's interesting that this is not representative of anything that's happening in the literature. So how do we compare these results to anything else? So in sum, the study design really does not support the conclusions. Oh, especially the third part. Sorry, I forgot that. This is the most important part, really. The whole reason this study was published is because they say that these rigor-enhancing practices, such as pre-registration, methodological transparency, confirmatory studies, etc., all of these increased replicable trait, which you would expect that, okay, that's what they manipulated, but they never manipulated these rigor enhancing practices. So there was no intervention to test their effect, nor any controls within the study to compare them against. So it doesn't look like this study was designed for this purpose. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. So in sum, the study design really does not support these conclusions. So in a couple of days, Kathleen O'Grady's piece came out in Science together with the publication of the paper. And the title even is kind of interesting in this case. Registering transparency in large samples boosts psychologist studies replication rate to nearly 90%. I mean, it's exaggerated to 90%, that's one thing, but also the whole title is causal. And there's no design in this paper that supports such a causal inference. And here is first part, one part of what she wrote. And here, let me see this part here. It's the first replication attempt that has followed studies from their conception through to independent replication, says Brian Nosek, executive director of the Center for Open Science and one of the 4 lab directors. Rather than choose a sample of studies from the literature retrospectively, he and his colleagues wanted to track whether they could more easily replicate work that had tried to improve rigor right from the start. And we succeeded, he concludes. Which is interesting because the rigor enhancing practices that they talk about in this paper, there's no indication that any of these were used in the massive process of pilot studies that they chose these effects based on. So none of them may have been actually registered or transparent. Well, none of them are transparent because nothing about them are posted. Here are a couple of quotes, one from me, where I talk about the 16 findings used in this study were chosen very differently from past replication studies. They're not randomly selected from or representative of well-defined literature, so that's the selection bias part. And then my colleague Arkan also gave comments on this paper, and he noted that the authors checked whether the results looked different when they used other ways to define a successful replication. Some of those methods put the past replication rate as low as 71%. But highlighting higher estimates and burying lower rates in the details of the paper is disturbing and ironic, says Arkan, because some of the authors are ardent proponents of not cherry-picking results. So anyhow, the phase of our submission of the commentary, so how that came about. When Kathleen's paper came out, the piece came out, I posted about it on Blue Sky, and said that, like I kind of mentioned a few more things, but one of the things was selection bias. Richard Morey here replies saying that I'm reminded of this paper, a PNAS paper, with overlapping author lists, which claim that markets can predict what replicates and that this may be due to expertise. If this is true, then selection is a problem even by the author's previous work. So we have reason to suspect that this selection is actually a huge issue. So when I posted this, my colleague Joe Back-Coleman also got interested in this paper. He read it very carefully and actually found things that I had not caught because he also looked up the OSF repository, which went back many years, and he came across a lot of different issues there. And he asked me whether I would want to write a commentary with him. And I said, I've invested so much time in this paper anyway, so yeah, let's do it. I know it very well by now. So we wrote this in 10 days or so, which we titled Causal Claims About Scientific Rigor Require Rigorous Causal Evidence, first focusing on the lack of causality of any of the study design, and highlighting a few other issues such as the null replication of a null original considered a failure to replicate, which is really very interesting and strange. Aggregating dependent and independent replications, with independent replications actually having replicable traits as low as 73%. Aggregating within and across effects, which is kind of strange because then what does replicable to mean, and what kind of a population are we trying to sample from? The replicability metric and how it has been calculated, it is very strange to begin with. Again, ignoring the whole confirmatory studies and using the pilots, the results of the pilots, which we don't know of because we're not given any data of it, as the original study, ignoring the confirmation study and their results completely, and then comparing replication results to the pilots. So that is kind of very unique way to calculate replicability. And what is the role of confirmatory studies then? And then one of the issues that actually convinced the journal that, oh, there's something wrong with it, is something that came up when Joe and I took another look at it and realized that the paper says all confirmatory test replications and analyses were pre-registered. Turns out they weren't. Like nothing about the meta study was actually pre-registered. And that doesn't mean that the pre-registration was missing. There was a very detailed pre-registration. It just wasn't for this study. It was a different study altogether. And finally, also design issues, not actually testing for the effect of rigor enhancing practices. Undisclosed selection criterion from pilots to confirmations. We don't know what's happening here. And within study publication bias, because a lot of the results from pilots to confirmations was subject to selection by significance level. So a firm p-value criterion was applied here. And again, why the reasoning of that is kind of, again, interesting. Why would you introduce publication bias within the study and then claim that that's representative of a literature? And how things could be better, really. So I skipped a few things here. On when we posted the our preprint of this Matters Arising that we submitted to Nature Human Behavior, Andrew Gellman, a Columbia statistician, wrote a blog post about it on his blog, and Jessica Hallman, a computer scientist at Northwestern, who also writes on Andrew Gellman's blog, posted this piece. And actually, Jessica went on to look at the materials for herself too. So she really read everything very carefully, looked through the OSF, and found things that we also missed. So here she summarizes some of the issues that Protocol et al. Defined replicability as the, chance that any replication achieves significance in the hypothesized direction as opposed to whether the results of confirmation and replication were consistent. They include self-replications in calculating the rate. They include repeated replications of the same effect and replications across different effects. And at the end, she also quotes something that Joe wrote on Twitter. We emailed the authors a week ago. They have been responsive, but as of now, they can't say one way or another if the analyses correspond to a pre-registration. They think they may be in some documentation. So when we asked them about the where the pre-registration was for the main study, because they claim that there's got to be a pre-registration, they were not able to produce it. It turns out they did not have it. Like the meta study was never pre-registered. So the journal, especially based on the missing pre-registration, they thought that was one of the major issues, which I disagree with because I think the design issues should be the ones that are damning. The journal decided to open an investigation. And during the investigation, new information came out as we dug deeper into the materials, and we found this pre-registration for the proposed overarching analyses for the decline effect. This was the study that they designed. Decline effect is kind of a supernatural phenomenon to explain the decrease of effect sizes across replications without necessarily appealing to any selection or publication bias or anything else. So it's got to be once an effect is observed, it basically gets smaller, kind of thing. And the whole study was designed to test this supernatural effect. And that explains the sample splits, where it says each confirmation study and replication study was conducted using a sample of 1,500 participants split into two halves. When inviting participants to take part in each survey, participants were randomly assigned to be invited to be part of first or second half. So when you randomly assign people to these different samples and fix the order, they thought that if there's a decline effect, the second half should produce lower effect sizes. Of course, they found null results. When you look at what's on the OSF repository, the results show that they did not find a decline effect, as they should not have. So Jessica Hallman kind of looked through everything and wrote another blog post, and kind of it's telling the title of it, the feel-good open science story versus the pre-registration. Who do you think wins? And she talks about the authors burying aspects of the pesky original plan and instead proceeding under the guise that they pre-registered whatever post hoc analyses allowed them to spin a good story, which kind of seemed to fit this paper really well, because it does. It is trying to sell a good story. It's just not supported with the study design. And she talks about the details of these sample splits and why that's important, because that was the originally designed study. All these plant tests, 3 of them, they are specifically designed to test for the decline effect, nothing about rigor enhancing practices. And interestingly, the authors themselves, actually, in one of the files that we found on OSF, which is the reviews and the responses to reviewers that was submitted to Nature before the paper got published in Nature Human Behavior. Nature rejected this paper. And in there, the authors themselves accept that they are burying the supernatural motivation for the study. They say reviewer one's fourth point raised a number of issues that were confusing in our description of the study and analyses, including the distinction between a confirmation study and a replication, and the purpose of using splitting samples in blinding procedures, and the references to the decline effect. We revised the main text and the supplementary materials to address these concerns and improve clarity. The short answer to the purpose of many of these features was to design the study a priori to address the exotic possibilities for the decline effect that are at the fringes of scientific discourse. So the authors themselves say that this is what the study was for, and they decide to change the story because I think the reviewers did not like the decline effect. And Jessica concludes her blog saying that it seems clear that the dishonesty here was in service of telling a compelling story about something. And one of the reviewers, original reviewers in this paper, noted the disparity between the original analysis plan and the published results and encouraged the authors to tell the real story. I think this was Tal Yarkoni's review, really. I think he had signed it, and it's you can find it on OSF, so it's not blinded at this point. I won't go so far as to study that there can be no utility whatsoever in subjecting such a hypothesis to scientific test. But at the very least, if this is indeed what the authors are doing, I think they should be clear about that in the main text. Otherwise, readers are likely to misunderstand what the blinding manipulation is supposed to accomplish and are at risk of drawing incorrect conclusions, which the authors did not do. They chose to go with the revised version of the study and bury the decline effect results in the design completely. So we got the first round of decisions at Nature Human Behavior after about 6 months of investigation. When we submitted our matters arising, they invited urgent revision based on 2 formal reviews that we have read, and they were long and very detailed, and 2 informal reviews that we did not read, but the editors have, and the response from the authors. Authors also got the response to our matters arising. The main issues that the journal wanted us to raise in the revision was the study was misrepresented, not designed to test for the effect of rigor enhancing practices, and the main analyses were not pre-registered. That was the focus of the journal. And maybe they allowed us to mention a few other issues, such as unsupported causal claims about rigor-enhancing practices, misleading comparisons to the literature, that non-existent 50% benchmark, and extensive undisclosed piloting process. They also wanted to bring that up. So the process continued. We got 2 more rounds of revision for the MA, and the journal made a decision to retract the paper and notified us of that decision on August 9, and decided not to go with publishing the author's response because the editors felt that the authors did not address any of the issues that we brought up in the matters arising. So they retract. The notice comes out, and it focuses on issues of transparency and misstatement of the hypotheses, predictions. The reported meta-study was designed to test lack of pre-registration for measures and analyses supporting the titular claim against statements asserting that everything was pre-registered in the paper, selection of outcomes, measures, and analyses with the knowledge of data, and incomplete reporting of data and analyses, like especially hiding the pilots and the original pre-registration. So our MA came out and the aftermath. So this is the last phase. The Brian Nosek, one of the authors, the most high-profile author, I think, on the paper, made this post on, I think, Blue Sky. We made an embarrassing error claiming that all analyses in the high replicability were pre-registered. And he says that, well, he denies everything else. He only accepts the lacking pre-registration and does not talk about anything else. And he says that thanks for the journal for their efforts to address and improve credibility of published research. And the paper itself has been retracted with an invitation to submit a revised version. This is really a false representation of what the journal says. They retracted the paper that did not give a revise and resubmit decision. They just left the door open for the authors to write the decline effect paper that they did not write and submit it as a new submission. So that's not really a revision. That would be a completely different paper. And the authors issued a statement on the same day, but only a subset of the authors. So there are 17 authors on the paper, and only 5 of them issued this statement saying that we agreed to the retraction because of the missing pre-registration, and the journal perceived additional problems. We could not endorse those reasons for retraction, so they do not agree with everything else that we showed evidence for. And Joe, my co-author, ended up writing this blog post about it. I did not want to write this blog post, but then he felt compelled after seeing some of Brian Nosek's posts online, and his blog post actually focuses on main points based on OSF project history that are undeniable, that the authors engaged in outcome switching, harking, cherry picking results, null hacking sensitivity results. So showing not really publishing anything that shows the replicability results were actually sensitive, and omission of pilots. And he concludes, whatever your thoughts, ask yourself, how many changes, updates, switched analyses, outcomes, rewrites would it take to call this more than an embarrassing mistake? How many mistakes are we allowed until we cannot shrug them off brazenly? At what point should we be held accountable for allowing mistakes to accumulate over the years despite repeated feedback? How many oopsies would it take before we interpret their "oh shucks" posts in the last few days as lies intended to cover up their actions? It's a little bit harsh, but it's really fair in this case. So I'm going to skip through this, and I'll try to finish in a couple of minutes. A couple of popular media pieces came out in Nature and on Wall Street Journal, where the authors say that, oh, we made a kind of silly mistake. We should have pre-registered it. And Brian Nosek still ends up saying, I think the basic conclusion is robust. The basic conclusion that is not supported by the study design. So anyhow, my observations from this whole process. This was an extremely long and stressful process for us. It included many more stages than I could have shared with you in this short amount of time. And we find that most scientists, including the reviewers in the Nature Human Behavior submission, do not read papers carefully. And almost no one reads pre-registrations or project history. And it's interesting, some fans of pre-registration and science reform proponents have interpreted this retraction as a win for pre-registration, which is kind of extremely weird way of framing this episode, I think, because this meta-study with unpreregistered key results was published at a prestigious journal claiming that everything was pre-registered. So the publication process really did not catch anything about it. The discovery of the study flaws did not really hinge on the existence or non-existence of a pre-registration. The study design and other OSF documentation played a huge role in finding the actual story behind this paper. And even a complete pre-registration would not help support the conclusions drawn by the authors in this paper. And meta-science, from my perspective, has very low standards of evidence for evaluating meta-scientific claims and claims about science reforms. And a few takeaways to all the audience: trust your own careful evaluation and not your gut feelings about a finding or your heroes. The study design, in my view, is the ultimate pre-registration. Like, it cannot hide what this study was designed for. So you really need to read the study design very carefully. It's easy to obtain low or high replicability to support a narrative of crisis versus a narrative of progress. These things are very manipulable, and replicability metrics are very highly sensitive to slight changes in design and calculation. Meta-science definitely needs higher standards of evidence, and from my perspective, scientific rigor, as it was claimed in the paper, is not about the claims that you make, what your message is, but how you support them. It's about the quality of the study, it's about your study design, it's about your standards of evidence and how you interpret the results in light of your study design. And basically, it's about honesty as well. So I'll close that here and happy to take any questions.